Hello and welcome to Hidden History, the stories from the Secret City. I'm Ray Smith, co-host with Keith McDaniel, my co-host. Now, Keith is producing a film today, so he's not going to be with us. But I've got a good guest with us today, Robert Burnham, and I'm glad to have him with us. He is a good author that I have his first book. I believe it's your first one, isn't it, Robert?
Yes, it is. Yep, and
The
another one
the Ar
forthcoming.
yeah, the Armageddon Secret, and that is available on Amazon. It's also available here in Oak Ridge at the American Museum of Science and Energy and at the K25 Atomic History Center. But we're going to be talking today. Now, you can talk about that book too, if you like, but we're going to be talking about a new book that you're working on, I believe. So, if there's anything more you'd like to say about introducing yourself, please go ahead. I've not done a very good job with that. And tell us a little about yourself and then tell us about the books.
That's a better introduction, Ray, than I've gotten in my previous 41 presentations on this subject. Often
Okay.
the introduce they say, "Here's this guy named Robert Burnham. Go." so,
Understand.
so thank you for that. Uh,
Yes.
yeah, let me back up here just for a minute before we run into the next presentation. Ray, I had the pleasure to meet Ray about 2 years ago when I was on a journey around the United States with a small group of scientists and historians and interested people. This group went to 5 different locations around the United States that were centers of activity for the Manhattan Project, 1942 to 1945 and beyond. Uh, First visit that we made was to Oak Ridge and to the American Museum for Science and Energy. And it was about my third time there, but first time with this group and first time I meet Ray. And so we've had a growing friendship since then. And he's been very helpful to me in some of my research work. And So it's been a pleasure to meet Ray and know him. And it's a pleasure to be on your podcast today. Thank you.
Yes, let's add just a little to that. You were here with the Stephen Ambrose historical tours, and at that time, I believe, and they were going to all of the locations in the states pertaining to the Manhattan Project. And
That's correct.
they had a person with them as the historian, Don Farrell. You remember him?
I do indeed. And I hope you're going to continue with what I hope you're going to say.
Yes. Uh, Don has indicated that that would be his last time to be their historian. So they asked if I would take on that role, and I have gladly done that. We're going to schedule our next tour coming up in just a few months. I'm not sure exactly the date. It may be even in early 26. But we will be covering all of the locations in the United States, and I'll have the pleasure and honor of being the historian for that tour. So I'm looking forward to that. And by the way, they also provide the Stephen Ambrose tours, also provide tours into the other World War II sites around the world. And they've got one coming up in March that is going to be covering the North Pacific, which will include the island of Iwo Jima and Tinian and Saipan Guam, and I'm going to be able to. I've been interacting with Don Farrell, and I'll be able to see him when we go on Tinian Island. So I'm looking forward to that, Robert. I think that'll be a good tour.
Great. And please say hi to Don from me. And I
Yep.
think of him from time to time, as well as all the time thinking about that wonderful trip. The Ambrose people are fantastic, put together an amazing trip. And I think it was almost 2 weeks. And I would highly recommend that to anybody who's interested in the history of atomic energy. Take that trip.
Yeah, and again, they can get that by just going online and Googling the Stephen Ambrose tours, and it'll come right up. Okay, back to
Absolutely.
your subject now.
All right. Well, my background, we'll come to in a minute how I got into this situation here, but uh, I'll just start by talking about the this being the counterpoint to Oppenheimer, the what 8th Academy Award winner, Best Picture, about 2 years ago, and this presentation and my work presents the counterpoint to the American atomic bomb project, which is the one with the guy shaking his fist. We all might recognize that individual, and we can just thank God that it didn't go a different way,
Yeah,
and he wound up with the atomic bomb before Dr. Oppenheimer and General Groves got there with it. Uh, the tower on the right hand side is one of the points that Ray was mentioning. I visited with the Ambrose Group a couple of years ago, and it was quite an amazing visit because that area, the desert of the Journey of the Dead Man, Jornado del Muerto Desert, uh, is Journey of the Dead Man is where this explosion took place outside of Alamogordo, and only once a year they open it up, that actual ground zero point with a memorial in the middle of it there for outsiders to come in and look at. And the Ambrose people were wonderful in coordinating that, so I could actually go there and stand there. And I tried to steal a piece of the trinitite fused sand material in the bottom, but I was told that if I did, I'd wind up in federal prison. So I didn't do it. I didn't do it for sure. But it was quite an amazing effort there to get us in there, and that explosion went off. And imagine if that would have taken place a couple of years earlier over in Hitlerland instead of in our world. At 5:29 a.m., July 16th, 1945, this picture indicates the moment when the world changed forever. All types of warfare became obsolete instantly. All things such as tanks and aircraft carriers and soldiers marching and making trenches, they all became obsolete in major warfare, and all military actions ever since 5:29 a.m. Hinged on a single question: will this trigger an atomic war? The result of this is these wars, small wars in comparison: Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Ukraine, and others. Imagine that 16 million people died in World War II, and only 20 years later, the start of the Second World War that resulted in 70 to 85. That's quite a round off error, isn't it? Just we don't quite know whether it's, give or take 10, 20 million people died in World War II. An amazing, incomprehensible loss of life. And we'll talk about how the atomic bomb played into that curbing of that sort of waste. And after 80 years, is it still important for us to be having a conversation like this about atomic weapons? What were the short and long term moral dimensions of doing this? Train we're riding on is passing through a strange and scary place. That being the case, how did we get here? Germany, some of you know, not everybody knows, that's for sure. My journey here has shown me that hardly anybody knows that Germany had a big head start in producing nuclear weapons. Hitler had uranium, great scientists, Nazi fanatics, 3 year head start, yet it didn't happen. We have a God in heaven, this interesting quote. He's just and cares about what takes place in the world, uttered by Thomas Jefferson long ago. Something happened. Let's take a closer look at what we think went on there 80, 85, 87 years ago now. What happened and what saved us? I'll run through this because the people quickly, because the people tuned into this already know most of this. But we know about J. Robert Oppenheimer, General Groves, and he reported pretty much directly to President Roosevelt. We'll show you an interesting org chart in a minute. Dr. Szilard, he pushed for the American project. He was one of the original people with knowledge about atomic fission and actually filed for a patent in late 1930s for an atomic bomb. And it was put under wraps and secluded, sequestered from the world for quite some time. But he was an original driver of this, and we have more to say about him in a little bit. Dr. Niels Bohr provided key information to America from his position there in Europe, and and eventually then we talked about Dr. Werner Heisenberg. About every 15 minutes, we hear something about quantum theory or quantum mechanics or quantum computers. Dr. Heisenberg won a Nobel Prize in 1933 for coming up with the theory of quantum mechanics. It's a brilliant individual. And Dr. Kurt Diebner was a German Army major, a PhD scientist, and leader of the German program for much of its existence, if not all of it. It's a little bit debated there. But Diebner plays a big role in this whole story as well. What did I do to learn more about this and eventually write about it and get to know many people about this related to the subject? I am a board certified forensic engineer, which means I'm an investigator of scientifically related or engineering related problems. So for 40 years, in addition to my career in the American automotive industry, as a vice president of various organizations there in the U.S. automotive, I also have been involved in forensic engineering, which means that I have to figure out what happened using the scientific method of research and other things such as Six Sigma and other techniques that are used in that kind of engineering work. And I consulted over 40 books, read them, and some of the key ones here are Dick Rhodes, The Making of the Atomic Bomb, Pulitzer Prize winner. Dick has become a friend of mine, and we correspond about various issues. I'll bring up a couple of them. But he wrote what The Making of the Atomic Bomb is basically the Bible of the creation of atomic weapons and how they got to be and where they might be going. But his is written in what we call a hard history standpoint with a tremendous background of research, and he was sponsored in his work by the Ford Foundation back in the late 80s. Norris, David Irving wrote a book I'll talk about in a second. This book, I don't know if you can see this picture here, but this book, the German Atomic Bomb. I was walking through the University of Michigan undergraduate library when I was an undergraduate, and I was looking for some books on my area of field mechanical engineering. I see on the table there's a book there called The Making of the Atomic Bomb. And I looked at it and I thought, what atomic German atomic? There wasn't such a thing as a German atomic bomb. I picked it up. I started to read the book and got a little bit through it. And I checked it out, took it home, read the rest of it, took it back. This is not the same book. I bought one in a used bookstore later, so I have no overdue fees on this one for the last 50 years. I got the book from a used bookstore, read it, and I was amazed that the Germans were doing what they were doing. I had no idea. From there, that began my interest in this subject. Later on, early on, I had read the book The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William L. Shirer. And some years after getting out of college and getting into my career, I wrote Mr. Shirer, who was the German CBS correspondent in Germany for CBS News World Roundup, right in this exact era that we're talking about here. He wrote 3 different books, of which I think I have all 3 of them, which I've read about the era and what was the sense, the feel, the zeitgeist of the Berlin in that time. And I wrote him a letter. And he wrote me back, and he said, "You've got a great idea writing about this German atomic bomb. I encourage you to do it." So I kept that letter, and I carried the envelope for it around in my computer bag ever since that happened. I've had that envelope from William L. Shire with me, and he was an impetus that got me going. And then Dr. Todd Ryder, Massachusetts Institute of Technology nuclear physicist and author of Forgotten Creators, has also become a friend of mine in more recent years. And I was over to visit him in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I think the summer before last, and we talked a lot about the beginnings of the German atomic program, which he has and provided me with thousands of pages of information that is just invaluable about that era. I visited these kinds of places in addition to others, but I went to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics in Berlin, the site of, because the building was demolished years ago. We'll talk about that in a minute. The Deutsches Museum in Munich, world's largest museum of science and technology, Imperial War Museum in London, Madame Curie's laboratory building in Paris, and of course, visit Oak Ridge and many other places around Oak Ridge that Ray actually personally escorted me to, and I'm very grateful for that. I visited the Manhattan Project Laboratories in Los Alamos, the world's first plutonium producing reactor, which was an amazing thing to see in Hanford, Washington. We'll talk about in a minute. And then I talked about Ground Zero. There's yours truly standing between my dear friends, General Leslie R. Groves and Robert Oppenheimer. So we had a good conversation that afternoon. They made a lot of sense. So did I.
I have a picture of that same scene.
Yeah, it's an amazing place to go around and actually look in the windows and of the places where Dr. Oppenheim and his wife lived, and to go to the various buildings there and a great sense of history.
I have to tell you that the movie Oppenheimer filmed there, of course, and in the Oppenheimer house, they furnished the house in period furniture. And when they had finished that filming there, they donated the furniture or the furnishings, and they are now preparing that Oppenheimer house for access to the public and making a good artifact and exhibit of the Oppenheimer house.
Thanks for that knowledge. When I was there 2 years ago or so, it was closed. The house was closed. And that's why I said I had to look through the windows. My guide said, "Here, you can kind of look through there. You can see where his table was and his kitchen was over there." And I could see them, but you say there was, I don't think there was any furniture. Maybe there's some sort of furniture in there, but I can't remember. But it was definitely closed off. So it'd be great to go back sometime and see it. But Dr. Einstein, in his Wonder Year of 1905, he came up with this elegant equation: E equals energy equals the mass of an object times the square of the speed of light. What that means in a practical terms, to get your head around that, is that you think of a match head and you think of a glacier. There's enough energy, atomic energy, in a single match head to melt this entire glacier. They multiply that by a few more pounds of match heads, and you know what this translates into. About the time that Dr. Einstein was thinking about E equals mc squared, this gentleman was thinking about something somewhat parallel. H.G. Wells, he foresaw the coming, in his writings, foresaw the coming of battle tanks, the sexual revolution, and he predicted the atomic bomb in this book, The World Set Free, by H.G. Wells, New York, published in 1914. And the blurb for it says, "The last war in Europe escalates from bloody trench warfare and aerial duels into a world-consuming atomic holocaust, 1914. Paris is, that's what, 25 years before they actually were on the track to the atomic bomb. He's talking about it. Paris engulfed by an atomic maelstrom. Berlin, a never-flaming crater. The Dutch seas in Holland. Moscow, Tokyo, Chicago, London, hundreds of other cities, radioactive wastelands. So moving ahead a few years, what is the, I'm going to get rid of this, origins of the, unfortunately with my screen here, I can't see the, the top bar that I'm going to do it by memory. Origins of the atomic program in Germany start back in 1934 when we have Erich Schumann and the Kurt Diebner, second time we mentioned him, nuclear expert hired by the German army. We have publications going on about uranium fission and plutonium production. Other things going on later in the decades. Germany starts bringing in uranium from Bulgaria and later on directly from the Belgian Congo. Germany takes over Czech uranium mines, brings in ore from Czechoslovakia to Germany on aircraft. And this was happened after the takeover of Czechoslovakia by Hitler in springtime of 1938. And then here we have the start of World War II is way out here, end of 39, September the 1st. And all this is going on before that. But in Berlin in December 1938, at this structure, which is called the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics and Chemistry, you notice here that this elegant building has an interesting structure here in the corner. It looks like the Kaiser Wilhelm's helmet of World War I, doesn't it? Because it was built with a royal grant right about that time. And in that building, all kinds of interesting things are going on relative to our discussion here, early developments of atomic energy. This work table, I took this picture of this work table at the Deutsches Museum in Munich. It's Dr. Hahn's work table that was in this building over here on the left in 1938. And this is where he made this dramatic breakthrough. See this over here. What does that look like? Doesn't that look a bit like an angel food cake? It's actually not angel food cake mix that making that up. It's paraffin wax. And Dr. Hahn and his associate, Dr. Strassman, they were investigating what happens to different materials when you bombard them with neutrons. So this box over here is bombarding, shooting neutrons through the paraffin wax and into these strips of uranium foil pasted on the inside of this annulus here. And they bombarded the uranium strips for 24 hours, and they came back and they took the strips off and they took a look at them through their instruments, and they found out that the uranium strips, the uranium of the strips, was virtually gone, replaced by two other elements. And so they had transmuted, in a sense of the old alchemists of the Middle Ages, had transmuted or changed the basic element uranium into two other elements. These elements were lanthanum and barium. And when they added up the weight of the original aluminum strip and the weight of the two elements that remained, there was much less mass there than there was before, the day before. Why? Because a huge amount of the mass had been turned directly into energy per Dr. Einstein's equation, and it was gone. Where did it go? They realized the atom had split and energy had produced a lot of energy, but over a period of 24 hours. This interesting cartoon, which was made after World War II, kind of shows this going on here. There's the 238 uranium over there, the natural uranium found in the ground and purified. It is split by the bombardment of the neutrons, It turns into two other elements that I mentioned, barium and krypton. Krypton is inaccurate in this cartoon. It's not that one. It's the other one I mentioned. It weighs less. Could that mean yes, energy let out there in the vibrations there, but over 24 hours? Soon the world knows of this discovery. This information was published in the February 1939 issue of Nature magazine, a very uh, august magazine, which still published very much these days today, was published well before that. But in that publication, they talked about the uranium being unstable and split, formation of two lighter elements, and enormous amount of energy released, 200 million electron volts. So that goes out to the world. Mr. Hitler wasn't too happy about that. They quickly put a stop to further publications about that subject, and there wasn't any more communication of any substance between Europe and the United States, Germany, the United States, and UK, and about that subject. But that did trigger the race. Off we go. But how do you get these atoms to split instantaneously vis-a-vis over 24 hours? You're going to get a big bang or you're going to get a fizzle out of this? Natural uranium will not explode. If it did, the Earth would have been blown up a long time ago, but it does not explode. And so that requires a new unstable element, a new unstable element. That new element must be produced by bombarding with slow neutrons that have been neutrons slowed down by a moderator material so that they drift into, at still a good speed, but much slower than they normally would travel. They drift into the nucleus of the natural uranium and transmute it into a man-made element, plutonium. It's too bad they didn't use H.G. Wells' name, Carolinum. That would have been an interesting tribute to H.G. Wells, but they chose a different name at the University of California when they were figuring this out on our side. They called it plutonium. Pluto was the Roman god of death. So we have the explosion taking place eventually in the desert of the journey of the dead man, and we have the material named after the Roman god of death. At this time, though, when Dr. Hahn is discovering this enormous new information, Germany is going crazy. I actually stood there at that site there with all these people here. I was not there at this time. I'm not that old, but I went there a few years ago to Germany, to Munich, to Nuremberg rather. This is the site of the Nuremberg party rallies that were held throughout the 1930s, and the fanaticism in Germany. When you see films of this or these kinds of pictures, it was unbridled. And accompanying this was the tremendous persecution of the Jews getting up and running. Kristallnacht of November 9th, 1938 was the beginnings, let's say the real beginning of the tremendous persecution that I mentioned. And you had Jewish synagogues becoming flaming rubble, and hundreds of German Jews stomped to death and imprisoned, and their businesses ruined. And if Germany's project can't be stopped and Germany can take over, then we have the death of civilization, and we have a new world upon us that would not be a world at all, perhaps. Hitler said in 1934, we might be defeated, but we will drag a world with us, a world in flames. There's no problem with him setting the torch of the world on fire and winding up with something like this times a billion. So the start of America's project is 3 years in the future, but here we have on the right-hand side again our Nazi our Kaiser's helmet over here. This is again the uh, Atomic Research Center I mentioned there in Berlin, Dahlem, west southwest side of Berlin. I visited this area here. The buildings are all gone or replaced with other ones. It's a pristine area with nice parks and forests and so forth. And it's a kind of a stark contrast to the destruction that they were planning inside this building. America needed a counterpunch against the Nazi bomb. Roosevelt didn't start the project until mid 1942. Einstein and Dr. Szilard warned of the threat in a letter sent to Roosevelt August 1939. Here is after the war, these gentlemen sat down and did a sort of a photo session reenacting the creation of the letter to President Roosevelt, warning him that something has to be done, Mr. President, because there's a great threat here due to atomic energy. They typed out Szilard typed the letter, and Einstein put his pen to the bottom of it and signed it. But nothing was done for 3 more years. Where were the Americans? That being said, the German scientists were about to encounter a problem. January 1941, America's not even on the radar screen yet, but they're already running into problems in Germany. And historian David Irving, among others, have called it the error of consequence. No heavy water meant no plutonium. We'll talk about heavy water in just a second here, at least for the German program. No plutonium, no plutonium, no bomb as far as they were concerned. Why no bomb for them? Could it be German scientists deliberately slow walked the program out of altruistic or moral grounds or something else? Hitler was distracted by the war and didn't push the project, lacking a strong leadership. Could be. C, the German scientists made a genuine mistake. Key scientific minds had already fled Germany, resulting in a brain drain. They didn't have the capability. Or anti-Nazis conspired to derail the project by deceiving German scientists. Let's take a look at these. Did German scientists deliberately sabotage the program? Dick Rhodes wrote in page 345 of his amazing book here. In 1941, German nuclear scientist Otto concluded that graphite would absorb too many neutrons to sustain a natural reaction. So you know, graphite is plentiful. They thought it might work, but Dr. Botte ran his tests in 1941 January and said that won't work. And nothing in the record, Dick Rhodes said, nothing in the record indicates that overestimate was a deliberate action. But this incorrect result sent them down the road in the wrong direction, at least temporarily. But 2 years later, Doctors Fermi and Szilard in America made the correct graphite calculation. And only 33 months later, the Valley of the Journey of Death. Remember that wax angel food cake? Heavy water was tested to show that it worked very well, even though the wax didn't work for what we needed to do with the plutonium. It only split those atoms, but it didn't make plutonium out of it. They needed, and we needed ultimately a neutron a moderator that would slow the neutrons, as I mentioned before. Heavy water worked great in everybody's tests, and eventually graphite worked great for the Americans, but the Germans continued to be barking up the wrong tree. Graphite failed. Nothing else came close to heavy water in terms of making plutonium, and that is according to their flawed test. We know about carbon graphite. It's everywhere. It's in pencils, it's in batteries, it's plenty of it in the ground. It's cheap. It's everywhere. So we had no problem getting our graphite purified and used in a plutonium producing reactor in Hanford, Washington. The Germans didn't know that for one reason or another. Heavy water, without getting into the details of what is actually heavy water, as mentioned in these first couple of bullet points here. Uh, until the 1940s, the only place in the world where heavy water was produced was in Norway. This plant that the Norwegians had built uh, starting early in the 20th century, took them years to build this. It was built to make ammonium fertilizer for their plants. And this oddball material called heavy water is trickling out the side of the production facility. They didn't know what to do with it. It didn't work for fertilizing plants. It didn't work uh, for drinking or doing anything else. It looked like water, but you couldn't really drink it, and you couldn't grow plants in it. It was no good. So they just kind of threw it away, or they kept some amount of it for sending off to people who were interested in researching heavy water. But the plant only produced about 8 pounds of heavy water per day running full tilt starting in 1934. Germany would needed 5 tons to make enough natural plutonium from natural uranium for a bomb. Why? Why did that boron become rejected and the only thing they were left with was heavy water? The element boron strongly different one again, we'll go back to the periodic table, and another element found in nature strongly absorbs neutron particles, stops them in their tracks. The test sample of carbon graphite that the Germans were using was probably contaminated with some trace quantities of the element boron. How did it get in there to their test sample? Did someone sneak boron into the sample of graphite? I talked to Dick Rhodes about this, and he said, Robert, you're speculating in an area that is fertile ground because nobody really knows. And said to me by the ultimate expert in the development of atomic weapons, I said, I think I've got something here. Next question is, did Hitler get preoccupied and lost track of the project? Interesting. Maybe he did. He had such little items to worry about, like Stalingrad and the failed invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion. It didn't go. He had a lot of problems here as the war ramped up, and so could be right. Look at this interesting picture. Dr. Todd Ryder was kind enough to provide me with this information along with a lot of other great information. And here's 1943, well into the war, well past Stalingrad. And here he is with all these scientists. This place was called the Reich Work Hermann Göring, and it had become the largest metal processing company in Europe, 500,000 workers. And what's Hitler doing here with SS officials and top nuclear scientists? Here's Diebner standing next to Hitler. Here's some SS folks over here. Here's Heisenberg standing here. Fritz Strassmann, Dr. Hahn's partner, and they're coming out of this building. And why? Obviously, Hitler had some interest in this metal processing factory, working on the very subject that these fellows on the bottom here are extremely interested in. Now, Hitler, however, in the sense of this confusion there, Hitler never appointed a clearly led team, but Roosevelt did. Excuse me, gentlemen and ladies. Groves and Oppenheimer, on the left over here, you see the organization structure of General Groves' responsibilities. He is the basically directly reporting to Roosevelt here through the Secretary of War Stimson. I mean, General Groves can pick up the phone and say, Mr. President, I need another $1 billion. Over here, we have on the Los Alamos project here, we have J. Robert Oppenheimer in this red box reporting directly down the phone line here to General Groves. And General Groves is out here all the time to Los Alamos as he was over to uh, all of the sites. But again, we have a very clear, very simple org chart here, how this Manhattan Project is going to work. Contrast that to this. The German atomic bomb org chart, 1939 to 42, the German army was in charge of the program for atomic weapons. And 1942, we get the SS in charge. So Himmler takes over and he's going to run the show, right? Throughout this time, there's an error here. It should be 1939 to 45, as I notice here. The Reich Research Council was also working on us. You got these three organizations here, Army, SS, and this other group, working like this. Isn't that amazing? Look at this reporting structure. Up here someplace, you've got Hermann Goering, you've got Kurt Diebner over here, you got Heinrich Himmler here, this Army Coordination Group with what Diebner mentioned over here, and they're filtering down to, what do we have, like 18 boxes here or something like this? And Kaiser Wilhelm Institute over here that we talked about with the Kaiser's helmet and these different industries around here, all working at the University of Leipzig, University of Munich, and all this tremendous, bizarre organization chart, a baffling mess. Again, Todd Ryder was kind enough to share this one with me, and I can share it with you. What about a brain drain? Number item D we mentioned here. Germany lost a lot of great scientists there in the 1930s. Look at all of these interesting names. Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb. Wolfgang Pauli, the Pauli exclusion principle. Leo Szilard and Albert Einstein and others. Lazard. And who stayed behind, though? Werner Heisenberg, Otto Hahn, Frank. We've all heard of the Geiger counter. Walter Bothe, Diebner, all four of these are Nobel Prize winners. So brain drain wasn't their problem. They had plenty of capable scientists. What about deception of the scientists by the anti-German underground? Some of you may have heard about or read about, or perhaps you read my book. You'll see a lot in my book about the Black Orchestra founded by General Ludwig Beck in 1938 to fight the Nazis and do everything they could possibly do to derail the Nazis' plans for conquest. They were strongly supported by Dr. Wilhelm Canaris, the head of the German intelligence service, and his associates, and that's somewhat akin to if you had in the United States J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI working on behalf of Germans trying to overthrow the U.S. government, or Germans in the United States, and people trying to overthrow the U.S. government, led by or strong participation by the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover. That's about what was happening there. So did this anti-German underground, anti-Nazi German underground called the Black Orchestra have anything to do with this? I like that idea. I like it a lot. So I wrote a historical fiction book about it called The Armageddon Secret. And 1939, a band of heroes has to stop the German atom bomb or humanity perishes. And so we take off in the world of spies and subterfuge and craft a book that's historical fiction, but inspired by actual events. Simon & Schuster came out a couple of years ago, published it. So where did this error of consequence leave the Nazis? After the war, only a small number of German scientists went on the public record through various ways. Some of them wrote some books. Some of them were recorded at Farm Hall, which was a project to try to capture the nuclear scientists talking amongst themselves and being recorded in basically a prison, I'll call it, where they were sequestered for a while. other places, the German scientists went on record and basically it was in their best personal interest to downplay the wartime German program, their knowledge of it, and anything they had to do with it. I had nothing to do with that at all. Don't look at me. But evidence exists that they built and tested a small atomic bomb in the last months of the war. Oppenheimer, this wonderful movie, in a key scene, the Manhattan Project leaders are assessing what they know about this program. And they said, one of the lines in the movie is, they don't know about carbon graphite. And they began cheering. And this is partway through. The Manhattan Project leaders are elated that they found out through means that the Germans don't have graphite to make plutonium. This belief persisted for almost 75 years. But research coming out now and declassifying of many documents reveals that this might just be wrong. It might be wrong. What did the Manhattan Project leadership know about the German project? The answer is not a whole bunch. Bohr and Heisenberg in 1941 September met in German occupied Copenhagen, and Heisenberg stated everything's being done in Germany, but he gave no further details on it. So that was confusing. 1941. Now fast forward to 1944, and there was an operative, very interesting individual named Mo Berg. His background was a lawyer and also a catcher for the in the major leagues for the Brooklyn Dodgers. I think one of the New York teams. He was a catcher in the Major League Baseball and also an OSS operative. He reported in his investigations in Europe. He spoke fluent German and traveled around there at the behest of the OSS, which was the predecessor to the CIA. He reported Germans knew little about atomic weapons. 1944. Fritz Kolbe, a top American spy over there in Europe at that time, he smuggled out thousands of documents about V2 rockets and so forth, and nothing about the atom program. And this gentleman here, Paul Rosbaud, a German spying for the British, codenamed Griffin, he looks a little like James Bond to me. He reported that the German project was not successful in various dates. But General Groves replied, unless it was proven that Germany was unsuccessful, they had to assume they were not slowing down and they were doing everything in their power to get to that bomb. Arthur Holly Compton, Nobel Prize winning physicist, wrote several memos in 1942 urging the acceleration of the atomic work because of his fears of a German bomb. This is an interesting excerpt from this writing. We've become aware that the threat of German bombs is even more imminent than we supposed. If the Germans know what we know, and we dare not discount their knowledge, they should be dropping fission bombs on us in 1943, a year before our bombs are planned to be ready, which is even optimistic. They didn't get them until mid-1945. But this was the fear. This is the source of that information. So what did they know? In summary, they knew that 1938 atom splitting success in Berlin happened. Germany was way ahead. They had Einstein and Szilard testifying to that. It was well known that the Germans had seized Norwegian heavy water, Belgian and Czechoslovakian uranium, and French heavy water and scientists out of Madame Curie's lab and other places. General Groves said, unless and until we have positive knowledge to the contrary, we have to assume that the most competent German scientists and engineers are working on an atomic program with the full support of their government and the full capacity of German industry at their disposal. Any other assumption would have been unsound and dangerous. The Manhattan Project believed the German program was well ahead of them. This is a photograph of a letter from American scientist Allison to General Leslie R. Groves, 1944. And in this paragraph, he says, the enemy was considerably in advance of us in certain work. These gentlemen had good reason to have nightmares about German atomic bombs coming down on us. There are two kinds of atomic bombs. We pretty much all are aware of that. Plutonium bomb and uranium bomb. And I'll skip through this quickly because you are going to know this already, living in the environment where the uranium was processed and the plutonium test reactor began. And the amount of plutonium required to make an atomic bomb was the size of an orange. If you think about that right there, in theory, you wouldn't need a lot of it, right? Just on the size of an orange. As I recall, that orange, though, made out of that heavy plutonium, the orange weighed 14 pounds. But the uranium bomb, to isolate the isotope 235 out of the natural uranium, which exists in less than 1% of the atoms in the natural uranium, is uranium 235. The isotope separation process is very difficult to pursue, and the Manhattan Project followed that and other things. So let's talk about those in a minute. The gun assembly process of making an atomic explosion through a gun, basically mount a howitzer inside of a shell, and you fire using a regular shell type of arrangement. Here I'm greatly oversimplifying this, but just to get the idea through. Subcritical pieces of uranium-235 are then blown together, reach critical mass, and hopefully pow. Plutonium is much more radioactively uh, uh, energetic, and it will not work this way with the simple gun method. It just explodes too quickly, and we wind up back to our earlier slide of a fizzle. So they had to come up with a new way to compress the plutonium as opposed to the compressing the uranium-235. They compressed this plutonium using explosive lenses that would explode simultaneously within, I think, a few millionths of a second of one another, these different charges of conventional explosive, and just crush in the plutonium, compress it enough that critical mass is reached, and in one ball, and then that blows up with more energy than the uranium version does. But this is a very complex apparatus here to make all these explode at the same time, and so complicated and so dicey that they had to actually make the lengths of the wires that would transmit the electricity from the control box over to each one of these. I think there were 34 of these segments in the implosion bomb. Make them the same length, these wires, so that the electrons traveling along there would travel at all the same distance, and all arrive at the same time at the detonator. So we're talking again the time that it takes electrons to fly through copper. That makes the difference, and they figured that out eventually, and they were able to pursue it, make it work. So there's 4 ways to make an atomic bomb. Build an atomic reactor to convert the uranium into plutonium, or the other ones are extract the uranium-235 from natural uranium, concentrate it. Do this by liquid uranium hexafluoride to separate the lighter from the heavier, the Oak Ridge S50 plant. Ray's going to step in here in a minute and tell me I'm all wrong. I think I'm on the right track here.
Oh, you're fine.
Electromagnetic what's that?
You're fine.
Okay. So far. The electromagnetic separation. And Ray took me, as I mentioned earlier, to some of the existing buildings, buildings still existing. Most of it is, unfortunately for history, been demolished, but you can still see the remnants clearly. Uh, the gaseous diffusion methodology, incredibly small pinholes, you push this gaseous uranium hexafluoride through these tiny pinholes, and the small atoms of 235 flow through, and the 238 atoms stay behind. And that was quite a challenge. And believe it or not, my original automotive industry employer that put me through graduate school at the University of Michigan, Chrysler Corporation, had a lot to do with coming up with this gaseous diffusion process, the plating of the nickel like bumpers onto the substrate to allow the creation of these pinholes. And in my first office that I had at Chrysler was that they would point out to me, oh, well, down there in that other area of this plant, that's where these guys in the World War II had their atomic bomb research set up right over there. That was pretty interesting because I was already a fan of that. But each one of these processes requires huge industrial resources to accomplish, as witness the work at Oak Ridge. General Groves said, do them all. So the atomic reactor to convert uranium into plutonium, I stood there and took this picture on the left of the wall of, I think there are 2,600 cells there that are producing plutonium from uranium 238 using carbon as the moderator. And they built that plant in 11 months, start to finish. Some of the walls 27 feet thick, 750,000 yards of concrete, 11 months. Today, we couldn't even get the first couple permits done in 11 months, but they did it. And it's what I call the amazement at the works of man. When I stood there and looked at that, I took the tour of the plant. I think that plant, Ray, ran from 1944 to somewhere in the 1970s, I think, without any interruption of any significance, resulting in Fat Man over here, the plutonium 239 bomb with the plutonium, and the projectile method little boy over here on the right side. So did Germany give up in 1941? That's what everybody thought. Pretty much they gave up. And Heisenberg is confused in 1941, but the work goes on. The atomic machine comes about in June 1942. That's this thing over here. The L1 atomic machine did use 10 tons of uranium at 5 tons of heavy water, but it exploded. And I believe there was one of their scientists was killed, not one of their major ones, but it was a mess. And but they went on to L2, 3, and 4, and they continued to build produce their heavy water until the Allies destroyed their plants in Norway, and yet they pushed forward. And by the end of the war, they had an atomic reactor that was coming close to being completed in Hagerloch, Germany, and they were trying to complete by the end of the war. However, PBS, Public Broadcasting NOVA program broadcast in 2005 on a program. During the last months of the war, a small group of scientists working in secret under Diebner built and tested a nuclear device. German historian Rainier Karlich reported on this event, but it remains controversial. So here you can see on the left here, this was an aerial view of March 1945 of this test site. And if you were to look real carefully at it, which I can do if I blow it up, you can see that there are a crater here and radiating striations coming out in all directions, like the craters on the moon that you would see in photographs. starting from here, radiating out. Here is the 1945 aerial view of the Trinity site. Similar striations. If you look at the same thing over here, they're easier to see in the American view, but this is pretty well established that something happened, and uh, and uh, and it appears that they got far enough to actually blow up a nuclear device at that time. Germany spent billions on their rocket programs. Excuse me, 10,000 people working on them. And by 1944, September, they were bombarding London with B-2 ballistic missiles, but with very little effect, actually. The Germans' V-2s, 1 and 2, cost the equivalent of about 50 billion in 2024 dollars, 50% more than the cost of the Manhattan Project. And they managed to knock off about 2,000 or so unfortunate Britons. But what would have happened if the Nazis had put this kind of effort into a nuclear Manhattan Project 3 years before America? Some believe they have evidence that Germany flat out ran out of time. Remember what Jefferson said: God in heaven is just and cares about what takes place in this world. Dr. Ryder and his colleagues have been working very diligently to figure out what happened with the heavy water. How did they get enough heavy water? If this was blown up in 1943, how did they get enough heavy water to be building enough, gathering enough heavy water they could make an atomic pile and make some plutonium and so forth? There's the Hagerlock, I'm sorry, Vermont, Norway plant, destroyed in 1942 and 43. But we're finding that there might be as many as 26 sites for production of heavy water by the end of World War II. Down in Italy and throughout Europe, here up in rebuilding the Norsk hydro plant. And so things were happening there in Europe that were not known until declassification of documents in recent years. How would they get such a bomb from Germany or Europe over to the United States to make a difference? Or for that matter, over to the Red Army closing in on them from the east? How could they deliver atomic bombs? We've seen this kind of picture many times. The A4 rocket, called the V2 by the Americans or by the Allies, they started firing these things off 6 months before Germany's defeat. The V2 was the part and parcel of the New York rocket, which you see from this schematic in Germany here, that again Dr. Ryder helped me find. He had it in his voluminous archives. The V2 rocket is over here on the left. Imagine putting wings on the V2 and a cockpit for a kamikaze German to jump into and fly it, more like an airplane. Then you take that V2 in that configuration and put it on top of a great big booster. This two-stage piloted rocket, compared with a V2, it would become, of course, a kamikaze mission that was being designed to carry an atomic warhead. It was not tested due to running out of time again. The idea is typical multi-stage, two-stage rocket, and reminds me a little bit of Elon Musk's Starship, 2 stages. And if Heisenberg's team, Diebner, had another 6 months to work, Hitler in 1945 said, "May God forgive me for the things I must do in the last 2 weeks of this war." He thought that he was going to have atomic bombs sometime in 1945, and by the latter part of 45, he'd be peppering Europe and North America with plenty of atomic bombs. All I needed about 14 pounds for each one of these bombs and a nice rocket to deliver them, or who knows, even some sort of submarine delivery or some airplanes that would be outfitted with sufficient range to get across the Atlantic or get over to Moscow, and he would stop at nothing. What is hard historical fiction? It's a book that emphasizes historical accuracy, and example of that is Killer Angels, that an historically accurate account of the Battle of Gettysburg, focusing on the thoughts and experiences of the key figures. It's fiction, but it's carefully woven around real events. When you write history versus historical fiction, so Dick Rhodes' book is straight up historical research, written in a wonderful way that is eminently readable, but it's straight up history. Historical fiction, E.L. Doctorow said that writing history is telling what happened. Writing historical fiction is telling what it felt like when it happened. So my next book that I'm working on, this is a mock-up, cover mock-up that I'm working on, and turn it over to the publisher pretty soon, something like that. Then their art department takes it from there. My idea and my working title is The Shadow of Armageddon. And just to relate to you the back of the book blurb, Hitler's SS called him Der Schatten, the shadow. Alexander Drake, who's carried over from my first book, the same main character, expatriate journalist turned clandestine operation, plunges into the heart of Nazi Germany. His mission is to track the progress of Hitler's atomic ambitions and, if possible, destroy this horrific project itself. He moved through the Reich like a ghost, a whisper in the lion's ear, but the iron fist of the SS was closing around him. At the forefront of the hunt, a relentless officer, a predator, driven by a chillingly focused obsession, is sworn to see Drake captured and crushed. Across the landscape of fear and suspicion, the hunter and the hunted engage in a deadly game of cat and mouse, a desperate dance with the fate of civilization hanging in the balance. So we hope to be having that come out later this year, and building upon limited but still there success of the first book, The Armageddon Secret. So that being said, the legacy of the race for the atomic bomb is what? A traditional viewpoint against Nazi Germany for the bomb. That's true. This shortened the war against Japan by a few months. That's great, isn't it? Didn't have to fight so long. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese were killed or maimed by the bombs, however. Very bad. This is a traditional viewpoint. There are now tens of thousands of nuclear bombs with which to destroy the world, and so the giant sword of Damocles, or 14,000 swords of Damocles, hanging over our heads. That makes Oppenheimer, Truman, Groves, and American general culpable of grievous crimes or grievous crimes against humanity. Is that true? Let's look at it a little bit differently. Consider Stalin stated to Roosevelt at the Yalta Conference in March of 1945 that if Japan were not defeated before the end of August, he would invade the major Japanese islands, and the 4 million man Red Army would take all of Japan, Korea, China, and Southeast Asia. In August, American troops were still on Guam, 1,000 miles away. And Ray, I think you'll be around there.
Yes, looking forward to it.
Yeah. And all these regions would have been behind the Iron Curtain. American invasion of Japan, Operation Olympic and Operation Downfall in October 45, January 46, 10 times the size of D-Day. The Allies would not only have to contend with all available Japanese military forces remaining, but the resistance of a quote fanatically hostile population, door-to-door fighting through all those Japanese home islands. Worst case scenario, published 21 July 1945. What is that? 6 days after, 5 days after the Trinity test, by physicist William B. Shockley, predicted that he was hired by the Pentagon to do this forecast. Hired by the Pentagon, he reported in his study said at least 5 to 10 million Japanese military civilians would die, with a corresponding American casualty up to 4 million men. Who do you think William B. Shockley might be remembered for besides something like this? What did he do in his life? A pretty smart guy. 1947, he invented the transistor.
Hmm.
Nearly 300,000 American POWs and interns would also have been executed in this ongoing invasion of the Japanese home islands. And last but not least, for 40 years since and counting, no atomic bomb has ever been used in war. The potential for world destruction has prevented another world war for now. Operation Olympic, many world war historians have said the atomic bomb saved my life. That included my own father saying that to me. He was stationed in Burma. It would have been pulled right over there. Approximately 200,000 Japanese civilians perished in these two atomic bomb explosions. But compare this to the American incendiary firebombing of Tokyo in the night of March 9, 1945, 100,000 Japanese deaths and about 1 million injured. Now, you had hundreds of planes involved in March the 9th, planes involved in the atomic bomb. So it's a very efficient way to kill a lot of people, but the result wasn't much different. Truman's choice, don't use this new weapon and sacrifice half Americans, 1 million American lives, or drop it and save our soldiers' lives. What would you do, and what would the American people, if they learned that Truman had a wonder weapon and to end the war and failed to use it, what would they have done to him? They could have gone something like that. But Truman played a classic poker bluff. He said after Nagasaki, he announced that if Japan did not accept the terms of surrender, they could expect a rain of ruin from the air, the likes of which have never been seen on this earth. He said in 1946, the plain fact is that civilization was saved in 1945 by the United Nations. United Nations in that era meant more the Allies. The plain fact, he says, the plain fact is civilization. The plain fact is that Nagasaki plutonium blast of August the 9th, after that, there were no more American atom bombs. There was insufficient plutonium and enriched uranium to build anymore, and they wouldn't have had any more probably until 1946. Thank God that Japan surrendered August the 15th, 1945, and right after that Nagasaki bomb, Mr. Stalin was good on his word. He declared war on Japan. He said, well, let's see, I think I can go in there now with these atomic bombs in the hands of the Americans. I'm going to go in there and seize a lot of this land, and we're going to take over Southeast Asia, Japan, all those places. But he didn't get too far because the United States had atomic bombs in this poker game that Truman was playing, and he was basically stopped in going forward with his plans. Stalin was, and so Truman again, he said, I realize the tragic significance of the atomic bomb. Thank God it has come to us instead of our enemies. And is this the end or the beginning? Is it still important to have conversations about atomic weapons even now? What were the long-term consequences of this race for the atom bomb? The bombs dropped on Japan created the mutually assured destruction strategy, MAD, MAD, Mexican standoff. You kill me and I'll kill you. stopped another world war with 80 million people, whatever it would be nowadays, for 8 decades and counting. But there's still 13,000 nuclear warheads scattered around the world. Ray showed me where in Oak Ridge the plant, and right now you'll have to tell me, Ray, which one of them is still surviving and is used for dismantling the atomic bombs from Russia and from the United States. But they're cut
Uh,
down by about half from
yeah,
what they were at their peak.
that's the Y-12 plant. It's a nuclear
Y12.
weapon plant.
Yes, thank you.
Mhm.
And the smaller ones, though, smaller atomic bombs that are still around are 80 times larger than the first bombs of 45. But most of these are hydrogen bombs, these 13,000, 1,000 times as powerful as atomic bombs. So you can imagine 80 times 10, 80 times 1,000, 80,000 times more powerful than those first bombs in Japan. So we have Ukraine, we have Taiwan, we have terrorist attacks, we have accidental launch. In 2022, Biden says nuclear Armageddon risk. Thank you, Mr. Biden, for mentioning my book. It's the highest since 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis.
Hmm.
Putin rattles his Satan II nuclear saber to hide Russian failures in a nuclear war. And I think it was last summer he announced he's lowering the threshold for the use of atomic weapons in war. So, what kind of risks are we facing right now? As our discussion and our consideration of the development and the way our railroad train and engine is rolling down the track, is that germane to these times? Absolutely, it is. So, aside
Right.
from a little uh, post log here,
Okay.
thank you for listening to me today, and thank you, Ray, for having me on.
Yes.
Again, a little plug: the German atom bomb Armageddon secret book is available at several Barnes and Nobles in Florida and Michigan and Ohio, and on Amazon.com, and also Barnes and Noble and in Walmart.com. So I
Good.
have a website and blog. It seems to be inoperative right now, according to what I learned yesterday. But my son, who's a brilliant technology guy with all that knowledge, he's going to help me get it back up because it looks like it's been down for a few days. But I welcome on the blog and the website. Leave me a note or send me an email on the umich918@yahoo.com. I'd love to hear from you. And thank you again for your time today.
Thank you, Robert. Really appreciate that. And let me encourage folks to look in the next episode of Hidden History Stories from the Secret City. I will be, or Keith and I will be talking with Harold Stahn. He is a German travel writer who visited Oak Ridge and has agreed to come on our program and talk about his trip and his experiences here in Oak Ridge. So until next time, thank you for tuning in to Hidden Histories Stories from the Secret City.